We're going to get into radical Reconstruction now, theme 1. The period following the Civil War from 1865 to 1877 we refer to as Reconstruction, but that means that something's being rebuilt. So what is it that's being rebuilt? Well, it certainly wasn't the Confederacy. The Union military had damaged the infrastructure of the South heavily. If you remember back to Sherman's March to the Sea, it's pretty self-evident. The South was devastated by war. Damages to farms, factories, the transportation systems, huge losses of men. The federal government didn't think it was their role to rebuild the Southern infrastructure, which is slightly ironic, considering the states argued that they had states' rights and they should be controlling themselves. So those former Confederate states, it was up to them and the individuals to rebuild because the federal government didn't feel like it was its job. So what is being reconstructed? Well, one could argue that it's the Constitution itself. They're trying to rebuild the Union, and the Southern states had to accept those wars' outcomes in order to be reunited into the Union. This is the first goal of Lincoln, to reestablish the Union, or to preserve the Union. So what did they have to do? Well, the states had to show that they were subservient to the national government, or at least they had to follow the will of the national government, and 2, they had to liberate their slaves, and they had to do that by accepting the 13th Amendment. So are they actually rebuilding the Constitution? I would argue yes. Remember, slavery is built into the Constitution, and now they had to wipe it out. The post-Civil War Union attempted to reform U.S. democracy. Unfortunately, the former Confederates didn't want that. They didn't want to lose their dominant position. They didn't want to lose their dominant white society. One might even call that white supremacy. At least that's what we're going to call it when the KKK formalizes it. Most Reconstruction policies, therefore, had to focus on expanding democracy and to protect the rights of freedmen in the South. Freedmen, by the way, is what we're going to refer to as those former slaves. The first attempt was referred to as presidential, or Lincoln's Reconstruction. This was a relatively rapid re-entry of the Southern states. Only 10% had to swear allegiance. That's not bad. Only 1 out of 10 people had to fake that they swore allegiance to the Union. And they had to agree to the 13th Amendment. However, we're going to see that they didn't really want to, and they tried to get around it. Before Lincoln began the process, though, John Wilkes Booth assassinated him. We can see John Wilkes Booth here on the right. Huge story there. We don't have time for it, so we're going to move on. Andrew Johnson took over and attempted to implement Lincoln's policies. If you want to know more about Lincoln and John Wilkes Booth, read the book Manhunt. Very good. And we had this effort for the Confederates to strike back, or to retake the government, to try to go back to a period before the Civil War and back to that antebellum ideology. And it's the actions of the Southerners, not the federal government, that require the radicalization of Reconstruction. We'll get to that in just a second. We need to remember 2 things, and those are the Southern goals going into the Civil War. And the first was to have a subservient black labor force. They preferred slavery at that time. However, they're willing to accept a non-slave-based system of subservient black labor force. And 2, they wanted to maintain some semblance of Southern control over national politics. Remember, this is really what they meant by states' rights. They wanted to continue that expansion of slavery into westward territories, and they just wanted to make sure that they had some domination over the national politics. So even though they were defeated militarily, we're going to see they're going to try to keep their Southern way of life, which means they immediately tried to go back on their word to liberate the African Americans. They immediately started passing black codes. So we have presidential Reconstruction, which moves into black codes, and the Southerners started to elect former Confederate leaders and officers into Congress. And those former Confederates didn't suddenly change their worldview and change their mind. They're going to start doing exactly what they'd done before, even though they had just lost a war, kind of a do-over. Kind of like when the Americans, after the American Revolution, or after the French and Indian War, wanted to go back to salutary neglect. This is an example of a black code. This is the actual wording of it. No Negro or freedman shall be permitted to rent or keep a house in a town under any circumstances, and shall live within the town who does not work for some white person or former owner, obviously not trying to treat them as equals. And the Southerners were trying to use violence to protect their way of life. We call this the KKK, the creation of vigilante groups like the KKK and the White League. They engaged in violence against freemen, especially trying to limit voting rights. Please remember, this is not democracy. It is not rule of law. It is mob rule, and one could argue it is the worst form of tyranny. It is the idea that might makes right. It is not social justice. The KKK thought they were Batman, protecting the rules of society, that they were somehow the defenders of all that was good and sacred, but this is what the KKK did. This is poor Emmett Till on the left. He committed the crime of, well, we don't really know what he did. Whistled at a white woman is probably the most drastic I can come up with. Others say that, sources say he just leered or looked in her direction. But for that crime, the KKK beat him into this. So that's going to lead the federal government to try to overcome this issue. We'll get back to this in just a second in part 2.